In March of 1938, a county health inspector named Douglas Fairholm arrived at a farmstead in the remote hollows of Bledsoe County, Tennessee. He'd been sent to investigate reports of developmental abnormalities among children in the area, a polite term for what locals whispered about in church basements and general stores. What he found in the attic of the Creel family homestead would haunt him for the rest of his life. A wedding album bound in cracked leather, containing photographs of the same young woman in 3 different bridal gowns, standing beside 3 different men. All 3 men shared her surname. All 3 were her blood relatives. And according to the inscription on the final photograph, dated October 1936, the bride, Lucinda Mae Creel, was 4 months pregnant when she married her mother's younger brother. She was 16 years old. He was 39. The child she carried was genetically doomed before it ever drew breath. Before we uncover what happened in that house, subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It keeps these buried stories from vanishing into the dark. The Creel family had lived in the shadow of Walden's Ridge for nearly a century by the time Lucinda was born. They were hill people, subsistence farmers who carved out an existence on land too steep and stubborn for anyone else to want. The family name appeared sporadically in census records, always in the same jagged handwriting, always listing occupations like farmer, laborer, or simply none. But it wasn't until the 1910 census that the pattern became visible. Enoch Creel, the family patriarch, had married his first cousin, Temperance Creel, in 1889. Their union produced 7 children, 4 of whom survived past infancy. When Temperance died in childbirth in 1902, Enoch remarried within 6 months to Temperance's younger sister, Opal. Together, they had 5 more children. The family tree didn't branch. It folded in on itself like a paper fan, each generation narrower and more tangled than the last. By the 1920s, the Creel homestead had become a place people avoided. Travelers who passed through the hollow spoke of strange sounds drifting from the property at night, rhythmic chanting, the wail of an infant that never seemed to quiet, the creak of rocking chairs moving in unison on the porch. The local pastor refused to visit after 1923, though church records never explained why. A single notation appeared in the parish ledger that year, written in shaking script: "The Creel house is not a place for God's servants." Lucinda Mae Creel was born in January of 1920, the daughter of Tobias Creel and his wife Nora, who was also his second cousin. She was the youngest of 6 children, though only 3 survived past the age of 5. The infant mortality rate on the Creel property was staggering, even by rural Appalachian standards. Between 1910 and 1935, 12 children were born on that farm. Only 5 lived to see their 10th birthday. And every single one of them bore the mark. Inspector Fairholm's report, filed with the Tennessee Department of Health in April 1938, described what he called uniform craniofacial malformations present in multiple family members. His notes were clinical, detached, but between the lines you could sense his revulsion. Subject exhibits pronounced prognathism, flattened nasal bridge, and asymmetrical orbital placement. Fingers of the left hand are partially fused. Speech is limited to guttural vocalizations. Subject appears to understand simple commands but cannot articulate responses. Age estimated at 12 to 14 years based on dentition, though family claims subject is 9. He was describing Lucinda's younger brother, Caleb. But Caleb wasn't an anomaly. He was the norm. Of the 5 surviving Creel children in 1938, 4 exhibited severe developmental delays and physical deformities. Lucinda was the exception, an accident of genetic lottery that allowed her to appear, on the surface, relatively unscathed. She could read at a basic level, write her name, and hold a conversation. In a family where most members communicated through gestures and grunts, she was practically a scholar. It made her valuable. The Creel family operated by an unspoken code, one that stretched back generations. Bloodlines were sacred. Outsiders were threats. Marriage beyond the family was betrayal. These weren't rules written in any ledger or spoken aloud at any gathering. They were simply understood, the way a bird knows to migrate or a spider knows to weave. The family survived by staying isolated, by keeping their practices hidden, by binding themselves tighter and tighter until there was no room left to breathe. And when a girl in the family came of age, when she was old enough to bear children, she became a vessel for the bloodline's continuation. Lucinda's first wedding took place in June of 1934, 2 months after her 14th birthday. The groom was her second cousin, Hiram Creel, a man nearly twice her age who worked the family's tobacco fields. There was no ceremony, no guests, no pastor. Just a handwritten certificate signed by Enoch Creel, the family patriarch, and witnessed by Lucinda's father. The marriage was never registered with the county. Hiram was found dead in the woods 11 months later. The coroner listed the cause of death as accidental fall, though his skull had been caved in by something blunt and heavy. No investigation was conducted. No one outside the family asked questions. The photographs in the wedding album told a story that the official records refused to acknowledge. Each image was carefully staged, taken with a box camera on the front porch of the Creel homestead. In the first photograph, dated June 1934, Lucinda stood beside Hiram. Her expression was blank, eyes focused somewhere beyond the camera's lens. She wore a simple white dress, too large for her frame, and held a bouquet of wildflowers. Hiram's hand rested on her shoulder, fingers splayed wide, possessive. The second photograph was dated April 1935, less than a year later. Lucinda wore the same dress, though it had been altered to fit her better. The groom was different. This time she stood beside Micah Creel, her father's younger brother, her uncle. He was 26. She was 15. Inspector Fairholme's notes recorded his shock when he realized what he was looking at. The bride appears to be the same individual in multiple photographs, each depicting a separate marriage ceremony. Grooms are identified as H. Creel, deceased 1935, Ems Creel, current resident, and E. Creel Jr., current resident. All share surname and familial relation to bride. Bride's age at time of first ceremony estimated at 13 to 14 years. No marriage licenses on file with county clerk. Micah Creel was still alive when Fairholme arrived in 1938, though he rarely left the house. Neighbors described him as simple-minded and childlike, despite being in his late 20s. He could perform basic tasks, feeding livestock, chopping wood, but couldn't be trusted with anything more complex. He spoke in fragmented sentences and seemed perpetually confused, as though the world around him moved too quickly for him to follow. And yet, he had been chosen as Lucinda's second husband. The marriage lasted just over a year. In the spring of 1936, Micah suffered what the family called a spell, a seizure so violent it left him bedridden for weeks. He never fully recovered. By summer, the family had already begun preparing for Lucinda's third wedding. But this time, something had changed. Elwood Creel Jr., known as Junior to distinguish him from his father, was Lucinda's uncle on her mother's side. He was 39 years old in the fall of 1936, a bachelor who had spent most of his life working his family's failing cornfields and caring for aging relatives. He wasn't handsome, wasn't charming, wasn't particularly bright, but he was fertile, and in the eyes of the Creel elders, that was all that mattered. The third wedding took place in October 1936. This time, the photograph showed something new. Lucinda's hand resting on her visibly swollen belly. She was already pregnant. Inspector Fairholme's report grew increasingly disturbed as he pieced together the timeline. Subject L. Creel reports conception occurred in June 1936, approximately 4 months prior to marriage to E. Creel Jr. When questioned about paternity, subject became non-responsive. Family members refused to provide clarification. Medical examination reveals subject is approximately 20 weeks pregnant at time of inspection. Fetal development appears abnormal based on palpation and subject's reported symptoms: excessive fatigue, failure to gain appropriate weight, episodes of bleeding. There was no hospital in Bledsoe County capable of handling complicated pregnancies, and the Creel family wouldn't have sought outside help even if one existed. They delivered their children at home, attended by older women in the family who had learned midwifery through necessity rather than training. But this pregnancy was different. Even the family knew it. Lucinda began experiencing complications almost immediately. She bled frequently, suffered from seizures, and complained of pains that left her bedridden for days at a time. Her belly swelled, but she remained gaunt and hollow-eyed, as though the life growing inside her was consuming her from within. Junior, for his part, seemed oblivious. He continued working the fields, ate his meals in silence, and slept in a separate room from his pregnant bride niece. When asked by Fairholme about the pregnancy, he responded with a single sentence: "It's God's will." But what happened next had nothing to do with God. The child was born on February 14, 1937, in the upstairs bedroom of the Creel homestead. There was no doctor present, no sterile equipment, no emergency plan, just Lucinda screaming and two older women whose names were never recorded. The labor lasted 36 hours. What emerged was barely recognizable as human. Inspector Fairholme never saw the child. It had died within hours of birth, but he found the burial record in a family Bible, written in Lucinda's unsteady hand. The entry was brief, almost clinical. Girl, born February 14, 1937, died same day, buried Westfield. There was no name, no notation of weight or length, no description of what exactly had been so wrong with the infant that it couldn't survive even a single day. But Fairholme found something else. A letter, tucked into the back of the Bible, written by one of the midwives. It was addressed to no one in particular. A confession meant to be read by God, or perhaps by no one at all. The child was not right. It had no proper shape. The head was too large, the body too small. The eyes were open but saw nothing. It made sounds, but they were not human sounds. We wrapped it in cloth and waited for it to pass. Lucinda wept, but not for the child. She wept because she knew there would be another. Because there was always another. Inspector Fairholme completed his report in April of 1938 and submitted it to the Tennessee Department of Health with a recommendation for immediate intervention. He documented 12 living family members on the Creel property, 9 of whom exhibited signs of severe inbreeding, cognitive impairment, physical deformities, shortened lifespans, and what he termed an alarming degree of genetic homogeneity. He recommended the children be removed from the home, the adults be evaluated for mental competency, and the property be placed under state supervision. His recommendations were ignored. The official response, dated May 1938, acknowledged receipt of the report and thanked Inspector Fairholme for his thoroughness. But no action was taken, no social workers were dispatched, no police visited the property. The Creel family was left alone, just as they had always been. Fairholme quit his position 3 months later. In his resignation letter he wrote, "I have seen poverty. I have seen neglect. I have seen cruelty. But what I witnessed in Bledsoe County was something else entirely. A family that has turned itself into a closed circle. A bloodline so tangled and twisted that it no longer resembles humanity. And the most horrifying part is that they do not see it as wrong. To them, this is simply the way things are. The way things have always been. The way things must continue to be." He moved to Virginia and never spoke publicly about the Creel family again. Lucinda became pregnant again in the summer of 1937, just months after the death of her first child. The father, officially, was still Junior, though by this point he had become little more than a ghost in his own home, shuffling between the barn and the dinner table without purpose or presence. This pregnancy progressed differently. Lucinda gained weight, her color improved, and for a brief time, the family allowed themselves to hope that perhaps this child would be different. that perhaps the bloodline had one more generation left in it. The child was born in March of 1938, 1 week before Inspector Fairholme arrived at the property. This time, the baby survived. Her name was Opal, after Lucinda's grandmother, and she was, by all appearances, healthy. She cried when she was supposed to cry, nursed when she was supposed to nurse, and grew at a rate that seemed almost normal. But within 6 months, the signs began to show. Opal's eyes didn't track movement properly. Her muscle tone was weak, her reflexes delayed. She didn't respond to her name, didn't babble or coo the way infants should. By her first birthday, it was clear that she would never walk, never speak, never live independently. Lucinda stopped keeping records after that. The family Bible contained no further entries. No photographs were taken. Opal simply existed, another silent presence in a house full of them. And Lucinda. She was 19 years old, married to her uncle, mother to a child who would never grow beyond infancy. She had no education, no money, no way to leave. The world beyond Walden's Ridge might as well have been another planet, so she stayed. The last official record of Lucinda Mae Creel appeared in the 1940 census. She was listed as Lucinda Creel, age 20, married, residing in Bledsoe County, Tennessee. Her occupation was listed as housewife. Her husband, Elwood Creel Jr., was listed as farmer. Their daughter, Opal, age 2, was listed with no occupation. Nothing about the entry suggested anything unusual. It was just another rural family, scraping by in the Appalachian Hills, invisible to the wider world. But there was something else in the census record, something that went unnoticed for decades, until a genealogist stumbled across it in 2003. In the column marked Relationship to Head of Household, Lucinda was listed not as wife, but as niece. The census taker had recorded the truth, whether intentionally or accidentally. Lucinda was living as the wife of her uncle, raising a child born from their union in a house where the boundaries between family roles had long since dissolved into something unrecognizable. No further records exist. No death certificate, no property transfer, no mention in local newspapers. The Creel family simply faded from official documentation, as though they had never existed at all. But the house remained. In 1967, a logging company purchased a large tract of land in Bledsoe County that included the old Creel property. The house was still standing, though barely. The roof had partially collapsed, the windows were shattered, and the porch sagged like a broken spine. The company planned to bulldoze it and harvest the timber from the surrounding forest. But the demolition crew refused to enter. The foreman, a man named Carl Winters, later told a local reporter that there was something wrong with the place. The air felt thick, oppressive. Tools malfunctioned. Equipment broke down for no reason. And at night, when the crew camped nearby, they heard sounds coming from inside the house. Footsteps, whispers, the creak of rocking chairs. One worker claimed he saw a young woman standing in an upstairs window, dressed in white, her hand resting on her swollen belly. When he blinked, she was gone. The house was eventually torn down, but the crew did it quickly, during daylight hours, and refused to stay on the property after sunset. They found things in the wreckage: rusted bed frames, shattered mirrors, a box of yellowed photographs. But no one wanted to keep any of it. Everything was burned. Everything except the family Bible, which was donated to the Bledsoe County Historical Society and forgotten in a storage room for 30 years. There is no record of what happened to Lucinda Mae Creel after 1940. Some genealogists believe she died in childbirth during a subsequent pregnancy. Others think she may have fled the family, though where she would have gone and how she would have survived remains a mystery. Opal's fate is equally unclear. No death certificate exists, no mention in local records. She simply vanished from documentation, like so many others born into families that existed in the margins of society. Elwood Creel Jr. lived until 1952 when he was found dead in the ruins of the family homestead. The cause of death was listed as exposure, though he had been dead for weeks by the time his body was discovered. He was buried in an unmarked grave on the property, beside dozens of others. The Creel bloodline, as far as anyone can determine, ended with Opal. There were no more children, no more marriages, no more entries in family Bibles or census records. The name itself has all but vanished from Bledsoe County, remembered only by historians and genealogists who stumble across it while researching something else. But in the hills around Walden's Ridge, there are still stories. Stories about a girl who was married 3 times before she turned 17. Stories about a child born so deformed it couldn't live past sunrise. Stories about a family that refused to let outsiders in, that bound itself so tightly it strangled on its own bloodline. And stories about a house that still stands, though it doesn't, not anymore, where at night, if you listen carefully, you can hear the sound of rocking chairs moving in unison on a porch that no longer exists. The last known photograph of Lucinda Mae Creel was taken in October of 1936. She's standing on the porch of the family homestead, wearing a white dress, her hand resting on her pregnant belly. Beside her stands her uncle, soon to be her husband, his expression unreadable. Behind them, barely visible in the shadows of the doorway, other family members watch, silent, waiting, as they had always waited. She was 16 years old. She was carrying a child that genetic science would later determine had virtually no chance of survival. She was trapped in a cycle that stretched back generations, a bloodline that had turned in on itself so many times it had lost all sense of direction. And she was smiling. Not a happy smile, not a joyful one, but a smile nonetheless, as though she had accepted what the rest of the world refused to acknowledge, that some stories don't have endings, they just stop being told. The Creel family is gone now, erased from maps and memories, their name a footnote in the history of rural Appalachia. But the pattern they followed, the isolation, the secrecy, the belief that blood is the only thing that can be trusted, still exists in pockets of the American landscape, hidden in places too remote for outsiders to find. And somewhere, in a forgotten storage room in Bledsoe County, a wedding album still exists. 3 photographs, 3 grooms, 1 bride, all of them family, all of them doomed.